Life on Earth has a rich history, starting with the creation of the first prokaryotes 3 billion years ago to the present day where modern humanity has drastically changed the global landscape. According to Robert Strayer's Waves of the World, 4th edition, there have been 5 major extinction events over this period, one of which, the Permian Triassic, was caused by global warming and led to the deaths of 96% of Earth's life. Strayer describes how in the modern era, humanity is leading to a 6th extinction event as a result of human-induced climate change. This climate change needs to have prioritization, as according to the UN, there are going to be increased droughts, hurricanes, and rising sea levels rendering coastal cities uninhabitable within the coming decades. However, these effects are so drastic that in the present day, effects can already be seen. This is shown by the College Board stimulus, Urban Evolution, How Species Adapt to Survive in Cities, where they describe the differing evolution between urban animals and rural ones. Author Eric Bender attributes these changes to climate change, where they describe the growth of mosquitoes in urban environments, where in combination with the increased insecticide use to prevent this threat, insecticide resistance increasing in these populations, leading to the spread of malaria, one of humanity's age-old adversaries. With the proliferation of these issues that date back to the dawn of humanity and the window of opportunity closing, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, stresses for urgent social and political action in order to mitigate the aforementioned climate impacts. This has caused a historic rise in climate activism in the 21st century in order to make governments and society respond. However, there's debate among those in power on how exactly to respond to this activism, with topics ranging from differing scales of action to inconcise politics. This development raises the question, how can climate activism be improved based on current barriers to climate action to increase social and political action against the climate crisis? Good morning, my name is Diego Salazar, and this is Reevaluating Climate Activism. As a result of my research, I concluded that as bottom-up change in society and partisanship during legislation are currently barriers to climate action, activism should occur within current institutional spaces, as this increases social and political efficacy. First, the significance of bottom-up change is heavily debated among those in power. For example, former Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, explains in his response to criticism against his climate policies as follows. The suggestion that any way, shape, or form that Australia accountable for 1.3% of the world's emissions, that the individual actions of Australia are impacting directly on specific fire events, whether it's here or anywhere else in the world, that doesn't bear up to credible scientific evidence. Essentially, Morrison is saying that because smaller carbon contributors like Australia with 1.3% of emissions have a smaller impact on the total global climate change, their actions should not be prioritized. However, the affirmation of this perspective is problematic because it assumes a false notion that this action is insignificant, while it is significant. This is shown by PhD social psychologist Carly D. Trott, where she describes how the solutions to climate change are profoundly social and psychological, explaining how individual actions contribute to the global culture of climate change and how that culture eventually sets precedents for new political action. The IPCC scientific data supports Trott, where a summary of their latest assessment goes as follows. Our assessment clearly shows that tackling all these different challenges involves everyone, governments, the private sector, civil society, working together to prioritize risk reduction, as well as equity and justice in decision-making and investment. In our individualist culture, any cause is often driven by profits. However, this backseats climate change as a priority if it's not profitable. So although Morrison made a point about the direct impact of Australia on the global climate change, their action is still essential as it contributes to the global culture previously mentioned. Now, the importance of bipartisanship is also extremely important, and not having it is extremely detrimental to any movement. This is shown by Joshua A. Bastichis, a PhD sociologist, where he describes how in state legislatures, Republican leadership acts as a veto point for any climate policy. This is significant because having the bottom-up change in state legislatures is necessary for the federal government and beyond, and not having political consensus will prevent this. However, in order to fix this, it's an issue as, according to Susan Clayton, having a PhD in psychology from Yale University, the perceived acceptability of policies based on the conservative acceptability of policies is heavily correlated with the perceived fairness of policy, where, for example, subsidies are seen as more fair and therefore more acceptable, whilst individual taxes are seen as less fair and therefore less acceptable. This means that in order to have the political consensus, activism should focus on creating a consensus among both parties and to protect their interests and create cooperation. Now, in order to do this, I propose two different solutions: dutiful or disruptive dissent. according to Karen O'Brien, a professor, a psychology at the University of Oslo, dissent, or holding the opinions that differ from the status quo, can fall into 3 categories, 2 main ones being dutiful and disruptive, where dutiful is simply lobbying and disruptive is simply protesting, walkouts, etc. Now, according to Dylan Bugden, having a PhD in environmental sociology from Cornell University, he describes how peaceful protests do not significantly impact the support of the climate movement for conservatives after a peaceful protest. So this means that because disruptive dissent, or in this case protests, cannot influence the sentiment of the Republican support, it means that it should not be used as a main solution because the consensus cannot be improved for Republicans. Now, for dutiful dissent, according to Joshua Bassett once again, although some U.S. residents remain doubtful or dismissive of climate change, research shows that linking the issue to economic development or public health can increase policy support even among Republicans. So, using this dutiful dissent encompasses lobbying and advocating at organizations or congressional hearings, it can change the narrative and create a discussion among those in power to focus on economic development and public health, which can eventually create a consensus among Republicans as this protects their interests. So this leads me to my solutions, where having a dutiful dissent should be the main focus in the form of lobbying and advocating at conferences and legislative hearings, and it should be used in conjunction with disruptive dissent as protests, because although disruptive dissent does not increase sentiment, one of the limitations of dutiful dissent, according to Karen O'Brien, is that it has the potential to be ignored because of counter-lobbying from the fossil fuel industry. So because disruptive dissent can increase this view in the public eye, it can prevent this, and they can be in conjunction with each other to support each other's pros and cons. So as a result, through these methods, the general populace can have hope for the future, for a future void of climate disaster. Thank you, and these are my works.
All right, 2 questions for you. First up, how did your research question evolve as you moved through the process?
So originally I was going to do, my research question was going to be on the change of climate activism between like the civil rights era and present day, but I found that there wasn't much evidence for the civil rights era, and like any research done on that would found more on civil rights instead of climate change. So I decided to choose it in the present day, and with the present day, I was simply going to implement how it can be improved to make the research question more variable.
All right, and what's your level of certainty about your solutions?
So I'm fairly certain of the solutions because I used the sources that have many PhDs in relevant subjects, and so because Karen O'Brien in their article, they explained the dutiful, disruptive, and another type of dissent, dangerous dissent, which I didn't go into. They used evidence, and then I corroborated that evidence with other sources to show how dutiful dissent in the form of lobbying can change the narrative to an economic or public health focus.